The neon lights of Club Elite pulsed against the midnight sky as Blake Thompson stumbled out into the cool night air. At 23, the mayor's son was already well known in every high-end club in the city, and not for good reasons. Tonight was no different. His designer shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes had that glazed look that spoke of too many premium cocktails. "Come on, man, let me drive you home," his friend Pete called out, trying to grab Blake's arm. But Blake just laughed, fishing his car keys from his pocket. The metallic blue Porsche 911, a gift from his father for his recent college graduation, gleamed under the streetlights. "I'm good, bro," Blake slurred, waving Pete off. "Dad's got me covered anyway, always does." He smirked, remembering all the times his father's influence had gotten him out of trouble. Being the mayor's son had its perks, and Blake wasn't shy about using them. The engine roared to life, and Blake peeled out of the parking lot, leaving dark tire marks on the pavement. The city streets were his playground, especially at this hour. He weaved between the few cars still on the road, his music blasting so loud it made the windows vibrate. The speedometer crept past 60 in a 35 zone, but Blake couldn't care less. Officer Chen was parked in his usual spot, finishing up paperwork from an earlier call, when the blue Porsche blew past him. His radar gun clocked it at 67 miles per hour. With 15 years on the force, he'd seen his share of entitled rich kids treating the streets like their personal racetrack, but this was different. The car had run straight through a red light at the last intersection, nearly hitting a late-night delivery truck. Without hesitation, Officer Chen flipped on his lights and pulled out onto the street. The Porsche was easy to spot, still speeding and swerving between lanes. It took 3 blocks before the sports car finally pulled over, stopping at an awkward angle half on the curb. Through his cruiser's spotlight, Officer Chen could see the driver moving around erratically in the seat. Experience told him this wouldn't be a routine stop. He radioed in his location and the vehicle's plates, then stepped out of his patrol car, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with tension as he approached the Porsche. Music still thumped from inside, and he could smell burning rubber from the car's tires. Other late-night visitors to the area had started to notice the scene, some already pulling out their phones to record whatever might happen next. Little did any of them know they were about to witness something that would shake the entire city, a confrontation that would strip away the facade of privilege and power, leaving raw truth exposed for all to see. Officer Chen took a deep breath and stepped forward. After 15 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his instincts. And right now, every one of those instincts was telling him this night was about to take an unexpected turn. He clicked his body camera twice, making sure it was recording. Whatever happened next, there would be no question about who did what. The stage was set. A mayor's son who'd never faced real consequences. A veteran officer who believed in equal justice, and dozens of witnesses with phones at the ready. In the next few moments, everyone's lives would change, some by choice, others by force, but all of them forever. Officer Chen's flashlight beam swept across the Porsche's interior as he approached. Through the tinted windows, he could see Blake Thompson fumbling with his phone, completely ignoring police commands to keep his hands visible. The music was still blasting, the heavy bass vibrating through the night air. "Turn off the vehicle and step out slowly," Officer Chen called out, his voice firm but professional. He'd handled countless traffic stops over his career, but something about this one felt different. The growing crowd of onlookers added to the tension, their phone cameras glinting in the darkness. Blake finally killed the engine, but the attitude was evident the moment he shoved his door open. "Do you know who I am?" he demanded, stumbling slightly as he stepped out. His designer shoes scraped against the curb, and he had to catch himself on the car door. "My father runs this city." Officer Chen maintained his position, tactically aware of both Blake's erratic movements and the gathering crowd. "Sir, I need to see your license and registration," he stated calmly, his body camera recording every moment. "You were observed speeding and running a red light." "License?" Blake let out a harsh laugh, holding up his phone to record the officer. "How about I call my dad instead? He's got the police commissioner on speed dial." His words were slightly slurred, his expensive cologne mixing with the unmistakable smell of alcohol. A small group of late-night food truck customers had gathered nearby, their phones recording the unfolding scene. Some whispered among themselves, recognizing the mayor's son from his frequent appearances in local gossip columns. "Sir, this is a routine traffic stop," Officer Chen explained, his patience evident in his tone. "Your father's position doesn't change the fact that you were driving recklessly and endangering others." Blake's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being talked to this way. "Oh, so that's how it's gonna be," he sneered, taking an unsteady step toward the officer. "You trying to make some kind of example out of me?" The crowd grew larger and more phones came out. The tension in the air was palpable. A nearby food truck worker called out, "Hey man, just show him your license." But Blake was too far gone in his own anger to listen. "I've got some news for you," Blake continued, his voice getting louder. "Tomorrow, you'll be lucky if you're still directing traffic in the worst part of town. One call from my dad and—" "Sir," Officer Chen cut in, his voice remaining steady, "I'm going to ask you one more time to provide your license and registration. Your behavior is only making this situation worse." Blake's anger seemed to feed off the officer's calm demeanor. He jabbed his finger toward Officer Chen's chest, nearly touching him. "You don't get to tell me what makes things worse. I make things worse for you, got it? That's how this works." The gathered crowd murmured disapprovingly. Someone in the back shouted, "Show some respect." But Blake was too focused on his confrontation with the officer to hear it. Officer Chen took a small step back, maintaining a safe distance while keeping his composure. "Sir, step back and place your hands where I can see them. You're showing signs of intoxication, and I need you to comply with basic instructions." "Intoxication." Blake's voice rose to a shout. "You want to see intoxication? How about I show you what a drunk mayor's son can really do? How about that?" His hands balled into fists at his sides, his expensive watch catching the light from the patrol car's beams. The air crackled with tension. Everyone could sense that this situation was about to explode. Officer Chen's hand moved slowly to his radio, calling for backup without taking his eyes off Blake. The crowd had grown silent, dozens of phones recording what was clearly about to become tomorrow's viral video. In that moment, standing between his Porsche and the police cruiser, Blake Thompson faced a choice, one that would define not just his night, but his entire future. And in his alcohol-fueled rage, he was about to make exactly the wrong one. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Blake's face twisted with rage as he suddenly lunged forward, shoving Officer Chen with both hands. The officer, though caught off guard, managed to keep his balance, his years of training kicking in instantly. "You've just assaulted a police officer," Officer Chen stated firmly, taking a defensive stance. "Stand down now." But Blake was past the point of listening. The alcohol, the anger, and the audience had created a perfect storm in his mind. "I told you who my father is," Blake shouted, throwing a wild punch that Officer Chen easily deflected. The crowd gasped collectively, their phones capturing every moment. Some people started backing away, while others moved closer, not wanting to miss a second of the unfolding drama. Officer Chen's training showed in every movement. He didn't escalate the situation, instead using defensive techniques to keep Blake at bay while constantly giving clear commands. "Sir, stop resisting. Get on the ground now." But Blake kept coming. He tried to grab the officer's uniform, his expensive watch glinting under the streetlights as he swung again. This time, Officer Chen was forced to use a standard restraining technique, attempting to guide Blake to the ground with minimal force. "Someone's got to help that officer," a food truck vendor called out, but the professional security training was evident. Officer Chen had the situation under control, even as Blake continued to struggle. Blake's designer shoes scraped against the pavement as he tried to maintain his balance. "You can't do this to me," he yelled, his voice cracking with rage and disbelief. "Do you know how much these clothes cost? More than you make in a month." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Backup was finally arriving. But Blake seemed to take this as a challenge rather than a warning. He made one last desperate attempt to break free, throwing his full weight against Officer Chen. In that moment, Officer Chen executed a perfect defensive maneuver. With careful precision, he redirected Blake's momentum, causing the mayor's son to lose his balance. Blake went down hard, not injured but thoroughly humbled as his expensive suit met the cold pavement. "Stay down and put your hands behind your back," Officer Chen commanded, maintaining control while applying handcuffs with textbook precision. Blake's resistance had finally begun to fade, reality starting to pierce through his alcohol-fueled haze. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the scene in red and blue. The gathered crowd had grown even larger, their phones still recording as additional officers rushed to assist. Someone in the crowd started clapping, and others joined in, impressed by Officer Chen's professional handling of the situation. "My father will hear about this," Blake muttered into the pavement, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Officer Chen simply continued his work, checking the handcuffs to ensure they weren't too tight, while reciting Blake's rights clearly and calmly. A young woman who'd been recording stepped forward, holding up her phone. "Officer, I got everything on video, from the moment he started threatening you. Do you need a copy?" "Thank you, ma'am," one of the backup officers replied, taking down her contact information. "That would be very helpful." As Blake was helped to his feet, the reality of his situation began to sink in. His perfectly styled hair was messed up, his designer suit was dirty, and his usual swagger was gone. The crowd's phones followed his every move as he was led to a patrol car, capturing the moment when privilege finally met consequence. Officer Chen stood by his patrol car, calmly speaking into his radio, documenting every detail of the incident. The gathering of witnesses had turned into something of an impromptu community meeting, with people sharing their videos and discussing what they'd seen. The general consensus was clear. They'd just witnessed a textbook example of professional law enforcement in action. The night air was still warm, but Blake Thompson shivered as he sat in the back of the patrol car. Through the window, he could see people pointing at him, their phones still recording. For the first time in his life, he was about to face real consequences, and no amount of his father's influence could erase the dozens of videos that were already spreading across social media. The police station buzzed with unusual energy for 2 a.m. Word had spread quickly about who was sitting in the holding area. Blake Thompson, still in his dirty designer suit, sat with his head in his hands while officers processed his paperwork. His phone calls to his father had gone straight to voicemail. The mayor was in a late-night emergency session and couldn't be reached. "I can't believe this is happening," Blake muttered to himself, watching as Officer Chen filled out his report at a nearby desk. The officer's calm professionalism hadn't wavered for a moment, even as he documented every detail of the incident. Outside the station, a small group of reporters had already gathered. News traveled fast in their city, especially when it involved the mayor's family. Camera flashes lit up the night through the station's windows, making Blake sink lower in his chair. "Your breathalyzer results are back," an officer announced, walking over with a clipboard. "You're well over the legal limit." Blake closed his eyes, remembering all the drinks he'd had at the club. Each one now felt like another nail in his coffin. The booking officer looked up from her computer. "The videos are already going viral," she said to her colleague. 3 different angles of the whole thing. Over 50,000 views already. Blake's stomach churned at the news. He could already imagine the headlines. A commotion at the front desk drew everyone's attention. Pete, Blake's friend from the club, had arrived. "I tried to stop him from driving," he told the desk sergeant, his voice shaking. "I should have tried harder." The sergeant nodded sympathetically. "We've got your statement from the scene. You did the right thing by coming forward." Pete glanced at Blake, but quickly looked away, the weight of the situation visible on his face. Officer Chen finished his report and stood up, stretching after the long night. The desk sergeant walked over to him. "Chief wants to see you first thing in the morning," he said quietly. "The mayor's office is already calling about the incident." Blake perked up at the mention of his father, but his hope was short-lived. Through the station's windows, he could see more news vans arriving. His phone, sitting in a property bag, kept lighting up with notifications. No doubt his social media was exploding with the videos. "Your lawyer's here," an officer announced, and Blake looked up to see Mr. Richards, his father's longtime legal advisor, walking in. The lawyer's usual confident stride was replaced by a worried rush. He'd clearly been woken up for this, his tie slightly crooked under his hastily donned suit. "This is bad, Blake," Richards said without preamble, sitting down next to him. "Really bad. The videos are everywhere. Your father's political opponents are already calling for a press conference." He pulled out his tablet, showing Blake the trending topics on social media. Blake's name was right at the top. Outside, more reporters had gathered. Their cameras captured Officer Chen leaving the station, his shift finally over. Several tried to get comments from him, but he simply stated, "The body camera footage and civilian videos speak for themselves. The department will handle this like any other case." Back inside, Richards was reviewing the charges. Assault on a police officer, drunk driving, resisting arrest. He read from the report, shaking his head. "Blake, there's only so much damage control we can do here. These videos show everything." A TV mounted on the wall was now playing one of the viral clips. Blake watched himself on screen, seeing his actions through sober eyes for the first time. His threats, his aggression, his complete disregard for the law, it was all there in high definition. "Your father's office released a brief statement," Richards said, reading from his phone. "Mayor Thompson is aware of the incident involving his son and is cooperating fully with law enforcement. He will address the media in the morning." The lawyer looked at Blake. He's not going to be able to make this go away. Not this time. Reality was finally sinking in. Blake watched as more officers arrived for the morning shift, many of them glancing his way. His father's influence, which had always been his shield, felt useless against the wall of evidence and public outrage building with every passing minute. The sun was starting to rise outside, marking the end of the longest night of Blake's life. But as he sat there in the police station, watching the news coverage grow and his social media explode, he knew this was just the beginning. The consequences of his actions were only starting to unfold, and for the first time in his life, his family name couldn't protect him from what was coming. The morning news couldn't get enough of the story. Every local channel played the viral videos on repeat, each showing Blake's meltdown from different angles. The city woke up to headlines splashed across their phones, tablets, and TV screens. "Mayor's son arrested after confrontation with police officer." At the morning press briefing, the police station's media room was packed wall to wall with reporters. The police chief stood at the podium, his expression serious. "Last night's incident was handled exactly as our training dictates," he stated firmly. Officer Chen demonstrated exceptional professionalism in a difficult situation. Social media was exploding. Hashtag privileged kids and hashtag Officer Chen were trending locally, with thousands sharing their own stories about Blake's past behavior. A barista from an upscale coffee shop posted about how Blake had thrown hot coffee at her last month when she got his order wrong. The mayor's office had quietly handled that incident, but now everyone was talking. "I saw him do the same thing at the golf club," posted a former caddy. "He drove his cart into a water hazard and blamed it on me. The manager fired me on the spot." More stories kept flooding in, painting a picture of years of unchecked behavior. Local news crews camped outside City Hall, waiting for the mayor's response. Inside, Mayor Thompson sat in his office, watching the footage for the 20th time. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Other politicians, reporters, angry citizens, all wanting answers. "The damage control team is here," his assistant announced, showing in a group of stern-faced PR experts. They carried tablets loaded with social media statistics and polling numbers. The mayor's approval rating had dropped 15 points overnight. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Chen arrived for his shift to find his fellow officers giving him a standing ovation. "You showed everyone what good policing looks like," his sergeant said, patting him on the back. News outlets were already digging into Officer Chen's record: 15 years of exemplary service, dozens of commendations, and a reputation for staying cool under pressure. By noon, local businesses were taking sides. The coffee shop where Blake had thrown his drink posted a sign: "Officer Chen drinks free here." Other shops followed suit, putting up similar signs in their windows. The incident had struck a chord with people tired of watching the wealthy play by different rules. Back at the mayor's office, the PR team was reviewing options. "We need to get ahead of this," one expert insisted. "Every minute we wait, more stories about your son come out." They showed the mayor a viral post from a high school teacher describing how Blake had vandalized her car after getting a bad grade. That incident too had been quietly buried. The city council called an emergency session. "This isn't just about one incident," Councilwoman Park argued. "This is about years of preferential treatment. The public deserves answers." Other council members nodded in agreement, many facing pressure from their constituents. Outside Blake's favorite nightclub, reporters interviewed the bouncer. "He was always causing trouble," the man admitted. "But what could we do? He's the mayor's son." Similar stories emerged from restaurants, stores, and clubs across the city. A pattern of behavior everyone had seen, but nobody could challenge. By late afternoon, support for Officer Chen had grown even stronger. A local restaurant owner started a fundraiser for the police department's training program. "We need more officers like him," the owner told reporters. "Someone who treats everyone the same, no matter who their father is." The police department's social media team was overwhelmed with positive messages. People shared stories of their own interactions with Officer Chen, helping elderly residents, mentoring youth programs, always showing the same professional demeanor he displayed in the viral video. Mayor Thompson's political allies started distancing themselves. "Leadership starts at home," one councilman told the press. The message was clear. The mayor's inability to control his son's behavior raised questions about his ability to lead the city. As evening approached, more videos surfaced. Security footage from previous incidents, cell phone videos of past confrontations, years of Blake's behavior was coming to light. Each new revelation added to the growing public anger about the system that had protected him for so long. The city buzzed with anticipation for the mayor's press conference, scheduled for the next morning. News crews set up their equipment early, knowing this would be a defining moment for the Thompson administration. The question on everyone's mind: how could the mayor explain away years of covering up his son's actions? Meanwhile, Officer Chen went about his regular patrol, handling every call with the same calm professionalism he'd always shown. But now people noticed, recording their interactions with him, sharing positive stories online. In less than 24 hours, he'd become a symbol of what law enforcement should be: fair, professional, and blind to privilege. The mayor's press conference was set for 9 a.m. sharp. Camera crews had been outside City Hall since dawn, their news vans lining the street. Inside, Mayor Thompson stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. His hands were shaking slightly. This would be the hardest speech of his political career. "5 minutes, sir," his assistant called out. The mayor nodded, looking at his prepared statement one last time. His PR team had worked through the night on it, but in the end, he'd torn it up and written his own version. Some things needed to come from the heart. The press room was packed when he walked in. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing his tired expression and the dark circles under his eyes. For the first time in his political career, he looked his age. "Good morning," he began, his voice heavy. "I'm not here today as your mayor. I'm here as a father who has failed his son and failed his city." The room fell silent, reporters leaning forward in surprise. This wasn't the usual political spin they'd expected. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Blake sat with his lawyer, waiting for his bail hearing. His designer suit had been replaced by a simple button-up shirt and slacks. Gone was the cocky attitude, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. Back at City Hall, the mayor continued. "For years, I used my position to shield my son from the consequences of his actions. I told myself I was protecting him, but in reality, I was failing him." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Every time I made a problem disappear, I sent him a message that rules didn't apply to him." The reporters scribbled furiously as the mayor detailed incident after incident: the coffee shop, the golf club, the teacher's car. "Each time, I had my team smooth things over. Each time, I made excuses. And each time, I showed my son that his behavior was acceptable." At the police station, Officer Chen watched the press conference on the break room TV. His colleagues gathered around, all of them surprised by the mayor's candid admissions. "Yesterday's incident was the result of years of privilege unchecked," the mayor continued. "Officer Chen didn't just arrest my son. He showed him what real integrity looks like. He showed all of us what it means to apply the law equally." In the courthouse hallway, Blake's lawyer received updates on his phone. "Your father's taking full responsibility," he told Blake. "He's basically giving the DA a roadmap of every incident they need to investigate." Blake slumped in his chair, the weight of his past actions finally catching up to him. The mayor gripped the podium tightly. "Effective immediately, I'm establishing an independent committee to investigate every instance where my office intervened on my son's behalf." Anyone who helped cover up these incidents will face appropriate consequences. Social media exploded with reactions. People praised the mayor's honesty while expressing shock at the extent of the cover-ups. Local business owners started coming forward, sharing their own stories of encounters with Blake that had been swept under the rug. Furthermore, the mayor announced, his voice cracking slightly, "I'm asking the city council to review my conduct in these matters. If they find I've violated the public trust, I will accept their judgment." The reporters erupted with questions, but he held up his hand. Back at the courthouse, Blake's bail hearing began. The prosecutor presented a thick file of incidents, many revealed just that morning by the mayor himself. The judge listened carefully, his expression growing sterner with each new detail. "My son will face the consequences of his actions," the mayor continued at his press conference. "And for the first time in his life, I won't try to protect him from them. Because the truth is, I never was protecting him. I was only teaching him that he didn't have to be responsible for his choices." Officer Chen's sergeant walked into the break room with news. "The chief wants to start a new training program based on how you handled the situation. They're calling it Equal Justice Initiative." The other officers nodded approvingly. Finally, a clear message about holding everyone to the same standard. The mayor approached his closing remarks. "To Officer Chen, I offer my deepest apologies and my sincere thanks. You did your job exactly as it should be done, without fear or favor. To the people of this city, I apologize for betraying your trust, and to my son." He paused, emotion finally breaking through his professional facade. "I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to be a better father." As the mayor stepped away from the podium, ignoring the shouted questions, a new era was beginning in the city. The time of privileged exemptions was ending, replaced by something that looked a lot more like justice. And somewhere in a courthouse holding cell, a young man was finally learning the lesson his father had failed to teach him, that actions have consequences, no matter who your family might be. 3 months later, the courthouse was much quieter than the day of Blake's bail hearing. The media frenzy had died down, but the changes in the city were just beginning to take root. Blake stood before the judge in a simple suit, looking nothing like the entitled young man from that notorious night. "Your Honor," Blake began, reading from a handwritten statement, "I've had a lot of time to think about my actions." His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper. The courtroom was nearly empty now, no cameras, no reporters, just a few observers and his father sitting quietly in the back row. The judge reviewed the papers before him. "I see you've completed your first month of community service at the downtown soup kitchen. They've sent quite a positive report about your work there." Blake nodded, remembering the humbling experiences of serving others instead of being served. "The anger management program has taught me a lot," Blake continued. "About privilege, about responsibility, and about respect." He glanced at Officer Chen, who sat in his uniform near the front of the courtroom. "I've learned that a badge isn't just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of trust." Meanwhile, across town, changes were happening at the police department. Officer Chen's approach to the incident had become part of the standard training curriculum. New officers watched the body camera footage, learning how to maintain professionalism even in the face of provocation. "The defendant has shown remarkable progress," Blake's counselor testified. "He's actively participating in group sessions, sharing his experiences, and helping others understand the consequences of unchecked privilege." The judge nodded, making notes in his file. Back at City Hall, the independent committee had finished its investigation. Dozens of past incidents had been uncovered, leading to several resignations and policy changes. The mayor had kept his word. No one who helped cover up past incidents was spared from scrutiny. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I've received letters from several people you've made amends with." He held up a stack of papers. "The barista from the coffee shop, the golf club caddy, your high school teacher, they all speak of sincere apologies and attempts to make things right." Blake's father watched from his seat, tears in his eyes. He'd stepped down as mayor the previous month, choosing his son's redemption over his political career. The city had a new leader now, one who'd campaigned on a platform of equal justice and accountability. "Your Honor," Blake spoke again, his voice stronger now, "I can't undo my past actions, but I can learn from them. The night I faced Officer Chen, I thought I was above the law. Now I understand that true strength comes from respecting it." Officer Chen had received a promotion, but he still chose to patrol the streets. "It's where I can make the most difference," he told the local paper. His story had inspired a new generation of officers, showing them that doing the right thing still mattered. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, your sentence includes 2 years of probation, completion of your community service, and continued counseling." He paused, looking directly at Blake. "But what matters most is what you've already begun, the process of becoming a responsible member of this community." Outside the courthouse, the city was different now. Shop owners no longer feared standing up to entitled customers. Police officers felt supported in treating everyone equally. The culture of privilege that had protected people like Blake was crumbling, replaced by something more fair, more just. "One last thing," the judge added. "The soup kitchen has requested that you continue volunteering there after your mandatory service is complete. They say you've shown a genuine commitment to helping others." Blake nodded, thinking about the people he'd met there, people who taught him more about dignity than all his years of privilege. As Blake left the courthouse with his father, they passed Officer Chen. The young man stopped, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me what real integrity looks like." Officer Chen shook his hand, nodding in acknowledgement. The city's local news ran a small story about the hearing that evening, but it wasn't front-page news anymore. Instead, the headlines focused on the positive changes in the community, new accountability measures, improved police training, and a growing sense that justice really could be equal for everyone. Blake walked down the courthouse steps, no longer the mayor's son, just a young man learning to be better. He had his weekly shift at the soup kitchen that evening, and for the first time in his life, he was looking forward to serving others instead of being served. The story of one night's confrontation had led to lasting change, not just for Blake, but for an entire city. It proved that sometimes, when privilege meets justice, something unexpected can happen: growth, understanding, and the chance for real transformation.